Okay, and the channel is live. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watching 100 Movies. I am Christiana Ellis,
I'm Mike Mateen.
and tonight we have a pair of movies. I don't think we necessarily intended when we chose these two movies to have two challenging films paired together. Um, I like both of them, but they're
Yes.
certainly not among the more approachable movies that we have ever chosen to
Yeah.
discuss on the show.
And I was thinking that I didn't even think about the fact that their endings are very similar. It,
Yeah, well,
in,
yeah.
in style, not necessarily in theme. I
Well,
mean,
certainly in although I wouldn't necessarily say most of Beau Travail is surrealistic, the ending certainly kind of ventures there a little bit, which we'll discuss, I'm sure, just because
yeah.
it would be crazy to talk about that movie and not discuss the ending. Um,
Yes.
but yeah, so
For anybody, we will discuss spoilers in these
yes,
movies.
yeah,
And so what I was getting at is that both movies end in the suicide of our protagonist that
mm,
is done in a way like where I mean you see more of it in Mulholland Drive, but then remember at the end it's also transposes back to her dream state or whatever you want to call it,
right. It
the
it
loved one, whereas his in Beau Travail goes to his back to the nightclub.
yeah. And they both, in some ways, though, suggest that without necessarily giving us much to go on in terms of certainty that what we're seeing is exactly factual.
Right.
You know what I mean? But we'll talk about that. Also, incidentally, until I watched an interview earlier today, I was also saying Beau Travail. Apparently, it is Beau Travail,
Beau Travail, okay.
which is the French pronunciation, I guess. And so I had been saying Travail too until I watched an interview this afternoon. So I'm not making any special expertise claims there. But so, yeah, when we decided to watch these two movies, it was because we decided to take another look at the British Film Institute's Sight and Sound magazine's top 100 movies of all time, which we had discussed previously when we watched Jean Dielman, for example. But we decided to pick another of the top ranked movies that we hadn't discussed and seen yet, and so we chose Beau Travail, which is 1998 French language film directed by Claire Denis, and then Mulholland Drive, 2001 movie by David Lynch, which are number 7 and number 8, respectively, on this list. So these are high ranked films. And
Yes.
um, uh, I had I chose Beau Travail mostly just because, knowing almost nothing about it, I felt like I had heard people talk about it as being really good, and there it was on the list. So I said, sure, why not? But I literally had no idea what it was about. Whereas Mulholland Drive, I believe, was your choice, right? Do you recall your specific reasoning?
Yeah, it actually goes back to what you were saying. It's like it's a movie that you don't choose to watch a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and I find that I really enjoy is maybe not the right word, but it's a very good movie.
Yeah.
I wanted a reason to commit to it again, right?
Yeah.
And obviously by the length of time since we decided on these movies and when it is, some of it was by travel and vacation and all
Yeah.
that, but some of it was that these were movies that
Yeah.
we weren't just like chomping at the bit, sit down and watch, right?
Sometimes there are some movies that, even when they turn out to be great, there is a little bit of a trepidation to sit down and watch them. Partly, and it's not even so much the idea that they feel like homework as much as they feel like serious or heavy. Like, I can't watch it casually. I have to focus, and we're not
Yes.
always in that state, right?
The other problem I have a lot with Mulholland Drive is that I get parts when I'm not. watching it like it recently,
Mm-hmm.
I get a lot of it confused with Lost Highway, the other David Lynch movie that
Yeah.
I don't like as much. Like it's also surreal, it's very David Lynch, but it's there are scenes in it that are so bizarre
Mm.
that again, their names are similar, their styles are similar, that I transplant some of those things and I'm like, I don't know if I really want to get into that. And the things that bother me about Lost Highway are not actually in Mulholland Drive,
Well,
you know.
it's interesting you say that just because I looked up Roger Ebert's review of Mulholland Drive, and he actually specifically called out Lost Highway, but he was basically giving Mulholland Drive 4 stars and saying, for his own perception, this was the first of David Lynch's experimental films that did not blow up in the test tubes.
Yeah.
And basically getting at the idea that he's always been experimental and that has not always worked for him for Roger Ebert, but this one absolutely did. Um, so here's a question: do we want to go ahead and start with Mulholland Drive,
We
or
can.
all right? Well, so let's do that. So just because we're kind of already in it, so my own history with Mulholland Drive is that I remember a lot of people talking about it way back when it first came out. And as a a uh, smarty pants newbie film buff sort of person, I felt like, sure, I can see this big fancy grown up movie everybody's talking about, and I saw it, and I basically came away going, that was weird. I don't really know what to do with that, and didn't think about it very much anymore after that. That was certainly my impression back in 2001, but in the years since, I have become much more in tune with the kinds of things, not only that David Lynch is shooting for in terms of like surrealism and that sort of thing, but also the things that he's like responding to, right? Like the things that he's trying to tell stories about.
Yeah.
And so I was not ready for it when I first saw it, and I feel like I was able to appreciate it much more on this viewing.
Yeah,
Uh,
I don't remember my first like approach to it. It just because I've come at it from a number of different ways and a number of different times. I don't even recall really how I first got to this movie.
mhm.
What I do like about this movie and is that it does a lot of the things that Twin Peaks did really well. It feels more like that than any of his other movies, right?
Yeah.
And that I rewatched Twin Peaks probably about 5 years ago. I watched the whole series again, um, and it's the only thing that it's missing that Twin Peaks had was a little bit of like the humor part of it. There's really only the
Mhm.
one scene with when the hitman is in the again we call it the
Yeah.
dream state, right? The first 2 hours of the movie, you know.
Well, I'm not sure that any part of it, even the end, is really intended to be real in a traditional sense, but it
Right.
does feel like a different layer for certain.
Yes, the first 2 hours of the movie is different than the last 45 minutes of the
Yeah.
movie. Like it's regardless how we want to describe it, but
Mhm.
I always describe that as the dream state because it's
Mhm.
there are some clues into it. Like the movie opens with the red satin kind of it looks like curtains, but you could say it was her bed sheets. And then 2 hours later, the cowboy comes out and says, "It's time to wakey, wakey, girl."
Mhm.
Right, and that's when it shifts to the other part. So it's like there are some clues that it might be a dream, but again, it's not meant to be
Mhm.
literally a dream and reality, like you said. But anyway, in that time frame, the hitman in that time frame when he accidentally shoots through the wall and then has to like
Mhm.
chase the girl down, and then the
Yeah, there's
the
definitely
the
some Cohen
yeah, the
esque
janitor shows up, and then
black
the
comedy
vacuum
there.
catches on fire. Yeah, that black
Yeah.
comedy. There was much more of that in Twin Peaks, and I
Mhm.
really liked that part of it, with also the surrealism. But either way, having rewatched that back then and really enjoyed it, this is probably my second time in those last 5 years because I watched Mulholland Drive again after I rewatched Twin Peaks.
Mhm.
Like, went away from it for a while. This seemed like a good opportunity to come back to it going back to it, I do still really enjoy what it's doing. Like it's saying a lot of things without being very, it's not overt, right? Like the
Mm-hmm.
surrealism allows you to kind of pull what you see in how Hollywood works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like some of the things that are really fun. And sort of the last thing I'll say in the intro, and it's sort of divergent from what I was just saying, but without Naomi Watts, like this movie doesn't work, right? Like she's so good at
Mm-hmm.
playing the naive girl and then transitioning into like the hurt lover like that, right? I mean,
Yeah,
obviously it
yeah.
work like that, but it you don't feel the turn without her,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Just changing their names and changing their things like doesn't do what the movie's trying to do if you don't buy into her character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's it's funny that you brought up Twin Peaks. I mean, I think almost any discussion of Mulholland Drive is going to talk about Twin Peaks at least a little bit. But after, like by sheer coincidence, after we decided to do this movie, uh, a Discord that I am active in decided to do kind of a community rewatch and discussion of Twin Peaks, and so we're a little bit into. Actually, I think the next set of episodes we're going to talk about is the beginning of season 2, and I had previously watched most of the original show a few years back. And I say most of because I don't remember exactly where I left off. I know that I had gotten to the point where there was an answer to the initial principal mystery, and that something about after that kind of I fell off. And I've heard other people say that that's a fairly common experience.
It's very common, and the show itself lends you to feel that way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it starts to diverge. Like it doesn't, once it's not rooted in the mystery solving, it kind of, it can't really find its feet, right? It's
Right.
one of the, and that's why it sort of stopped abruptly,
Mm-hmm.
and then they came back. It was one of the original ones, shows where they came back and they did a TV movie to kind of close out everything that was
Right.
sort of left hanging.
Mm-hmm.
But again, once it had kind of hit its initial stride, like it even with the movie to wrap it up, like it just didn't ever quite get there.
Well,
But that's
so
okay,
but
right?
then they
It's
did
okay.
the return, right? Like which
Yes.
but from what I understand, having not watched it yet, but the people in this Discord group are very excited to have everybody get to that so they liked it, and so I'm excited for that too. But the point is just that I am echoing your take that Twin Peaks A is great. Um, perhaps it doesn't end as strong as it begins, but it's very good. And it's good in a lot of the same ways that this movie is good. And it's interesting because I was looking up the history of this movie, and apparently the original plan, there was a 99-minute version of this movie that basically ends before that last, like the specific place that it ended was the opening of the blue box, and it's
Mhm.
because it was intended to be the pilot for a TV show to follow up Twin Peaks, for David Lynch wanting to do a new TV show. But apparently he made that pilot and showed it to ABC, and they said no thank you. And so he kind of wasn't sure what to do with it for a little while, but then he went back and he filmed some more stuff for it, some little bits and pieces that go in the middle, but then also that whole sort of final act to give it like an ending. But he actually has said in interviews that he is, in hindsight, very glad that that's how it worked out, because he's much happier with the film as it ended up being finished than he was with the pilot that he had tried to show to ABC.
And again, based on how Twin Peaks sort of lost its footing,
Hmm.
I would agree that it probably works better when it's kind of self-contained and he had to define the ending before we'd gotten too far down the line,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I like it as it exists as opposed to another TV show.
It's great, is what it is. So like we've kind of talked about it in high terms. We should maybe do our best to like when I say summarize the plot. Anyone who has not watched Mulholland Drive, let me be very clear before I give you this brief plot synopsis. The movie does not all tie together in a nifty little clockwork box like some whodunit mystery. It is designed to defy that kind of expectation. There's a lot of things that deliberately don't connect. There are things that are deliberately confusing or unclear. And a lot of it is very much functioning on dream logic rather than, you know, physical, logical, narrative, you know, convention. And so, but the basic through line is that we start with, um, you know, Rita in quotes because she can't remember who she is, and she makes up that name, but she is in a car accident that seems to have saved her life in that she was perhaps about to get killed or something. Oh, it's a little unclear, but she is in a limo out in the middle of nowhere. Something bad is about to happen, but then a bunch of presumably teenagers driving cars recklessly hit the parked limo. There's an accident. She's the only survivor, and so she kind of just wanders off down into Los Angeles from this Mulholland Drive, which is this like mountain road that overlooks the city. And she's played by Laura Herring, and then she finds the house. She's sort of concussed and not sure where to go and scared, and so she sees this fancy house where it's actually not a house. I guess it's one apartment in a fancy complex, but with its own sort of courtyard. So she sees someone packing up and leaving an apartment and takes an opportunity to sneak inside. And so she is hidden herself in this newly vacant apartment, unknowing that Naomi Watts as Betty, who is, she's like a caricature of the naive ingenue fresh into Hollywood hoping to get discovered, right? Like, and played by Naomi Watts. And so when the two meet, they discover Rita's is amnesia, has amnesia, and so the two decide to kind of try to figure out who she is really. There's a lot of money involved. There's another film involved that's where the mob question mark it seems to be threatening a director to hire only the person they care about. There is you know sneaking into apartments and finding dead bodies and lots of other bizarre things that happen that seem connected or not. And that's kind of what happens up until this final act that you mentioned, where things seem to flip because now Naomi Watts is playing Diane Selwyn, who is one of the mysterious people that Betty and Rita were looking for before. Only now she is an actress who was in love with another actress. It didn't go well. She hires a hitman to kill her and then cannot live with the guilt. But all of that is again kind of functioning on nightmare, and it's a little bit unclear. Are we supposed to believe that is what really happened and the rest was a dream? Or is it more complicated than that? And I think the movie doesn't give us easy answers.
No, by no means. But what the movie does that is so great is with all these sort of bizarre through lines,
Mm-hmm.
it's taking pieces of Hollywood and it's basically building like so there's like this film noir part of it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it does like this really cool film noir.
Yeah.
But that's like just in this one dream world thing, right? And it it's kind of poking fun a little bit at the naive actress and the mob
Mm-hmm.
influence, right? Like there's like this sort of, oh, isn't this kind of wink wink like how Hollywood really is, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
where directors are forced to take actresses and stuff like that. Like,
Yeah.
and they don't get ultimate decision making even though they're these artists. And and the just the bizarre relationship with that the director, and again in the early act with like his girlfriend or wife or whoever, and like her just like ridiculously stereotypical like affair that she's
Yeah.
having. Like it's all like sort of this, it's not meant to be funny,
Well,
it's not really like deconstructing anything, but it's
yeah.
like it's just taking themes that everybody's kind of aware of
Mm-hmm.
and just kind of weaving it together in this really interesting way that he does. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that, like, especially when I talk about, like, being more in tune with what he's doing, I think what I'm really getting at is this can be seen in Twin Peaks and here, where frequently, if you were to, in just a sentence or two, just describe what happens in a scene, the text of what's happening and the subtext of the way it's being depicted, there's a dissonance created deliberately, right?
Yes.
Because when we first meet Betty, she seems to be coming out of the airport and she has already become fast friends with this old lady that presumably she sat next to on the airplane or something like that. And
Yeah.
it's like the idea is that it's like, oh, good luck to you. I just know those directors will discover you. And it's just this thing. And then all of a sudden, the old lady has a husband who just comes out of nowhere, but then he's like saying the same thing and is like, oh, and it's again, it's like it's the dialogue in all of it is like a cliche, but on purpose, where like the scene is inviting us. It's like it wants us to roll our eyes, but then question what's really happening.
Yep.
Because it's definitely like, if you I and again, I think this is one of the aspects of it that, like, I wasn't ready for when I first saw it, is because I think when I first saw it I was much more inclined to just take the scene at face value and think, this is kind of a cheesy cliche scene. Like, who is this character? She's like a caricature. And of course she is, by design, especially because, again, as the movie progresses, we're not even sure she's an actual real person. She is almost like an imaginary fantasy version of a person, or a an archetype of a certain kind of person. And then also we get the strangeness of this old couple that are just kind of ridiculously effusive for this young woman who they've only just met and maybe spent a couple of hours with on the plane. And if they live in Los Angeles, you'd think that I'm not going to say everyone in Los Angeles is jaded necessarily, but I mean, so they're acting again like they are the cliche that exists only to bounce off of her sunshine energy, right? And then that's borne out when they leave the scene. They get into their own car and we see the car driving away, and they're just, they can't do anything but just this plastered on grimace of a smile. And it's like the movie's telling us that they're barely real people, that they exist only to act that way.
Yeah, and one way that I take it, which by the way, like I also recognize what the movie does, like it's definitely not, there's not a solution like you said.
Mm-hmm.
It's he does this in the same way that like Hemingway was really good with this, right? Like where he kind of you imprint what you think is happening a little bit on the story.
Yeah.
And the way I've always taken it is that these are her in this dream world. These are her memories of kind of how she remembered herself coming to Hollywood, right? Like she was probably a little naive, but she was more
Mm-hmm.
complex than the actual character. But that's not how memories
Yeah.
work, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like she became in her own memory like this more, and then there were people who probably did encourage her, but
Yeah.
they've
There's
all
nice
got
people. Yeah.
right. They've all got kind of wrapped into these two people in this
Mm-hmm.
dream state, right? In this memory, they become these two people, and there is no depth to them because they are just an amalgamation of
Yeah.
encouragement that's in her memory bank,
All
right? And
they
that's how I
are,
kind of take it.
yeah, all
Yeah,
they are as characters in this movie are the tiny fraction of themselves that she remembers
right,
in her own self-absorbed perspective as someone who doesn't actually care about them but is pleased and flattered to have these old people like her.
yes,
And I'm not saying that that's like that she's bad in that necessarily, but it's again, it's just she doesn't really see them. She remembers this one little piece that all is all just kind of a chunk of a story, and it's like this low resolution memory of these people. And then when things start getting really bizarre later, of course they start showing up again in a way that, like, I'm not. I again, I don't think is probably intended to have any sort of a literal meaning when they start showing up like insect sized and crawling under her door and stuff like that. Like I'm not sure there's intended to be like, oh, that means X. I think it's just intended to be kind of strange and
right.
reflective of everything being fractured.
Yeah, that's exactly how I like what it's doing, and that's that part with where it ties back together at the end is kind
Mm-hmm.
of where I've decided that that's kind of how I see this, right? Is
Oh, I was actually just sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off,
okay.
but I was just realizing that their existence as puppets who can do nothing but enthusiastically support her naive dream to be an actress, there at the end, when it has all gone wrong, they sort of signify how naive she was, right? And they are trying to like push her, like they're trying to continue to support her in the thing that she has already destroyed.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
And that's what prompts her eventually to shoot herself,
yeah.
right? Like is that is the vision of them,
Right.
right? And
But yeah, one of the things though that's like interesting about like that is, and this is an example of the way the movie does not really make it easy for us to say that, oh, this last act is what really happened, because well, I because we see her shoot herself and end up laying in bed in kind of the same position that Betty and Rita find a body earlier. But when they find that body, it was not a body that had died from a gunshot. There was drug paraphernalia on the bed.
yes.
And so it's clearly blending two different things there.
Yep.
So is the gun perhaps a metaphor for drugs? Or could it be the other way around? It's like and but again, like that's why the movie kind of resists the attempt to like define what so really happened. But I like to its credit, like that's so rare in a movie, or it's so rare to have it done this well, where the whole movie is that, as opposed to like there are lots of movies that go for the like the Lady or the Tiger ambiguous endings, or even unreliable narrator sorts of things. But to have the whole movie just be this strange dream of an experience that is nonetheless calling upon all of these themes and tropes and ideas about Hollywood and noir and storytelling.
Yeah, I I agree. I just I enjoy the this is one of those movies where you always talk about, like, enjoying the journey, not the end, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is one of those movies that just that does that. And I think that, like, and I'm not trying to make it more profound than it actually is, but like that's something that we always want to do in life, right? Is like just try to enjoy the journey. And
Mm-hmm.
this movie, like, you can't just not be in the moment of the movie that you're in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the scene before and the scene that's coming next, like, yeah, they're all sort of tied together, but
Mm-hmm.
they're different, right?
Well,
Like,
I might say that rather than you can't not be in the moment, what I would say is it's a waste of time to try to be anywhere but in the moment.
right.
Because if you try to guess what's going to happen or you try to make what you're seeing now connect to what came before, that you're it's just going to fall through your fingers like sand. It's not you're not going to be able to make sense of it that way. It is a movie designed to be experienced in the moment, like you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like you
Um,
said, he does some brilliant things with how he connects the again, the dream state is just what I refer to the first 2 hours, to the quote unquote reality state, to draw these parallels that, like, don't necessarily make sense.
mhm.
But like, you already talked about the body, but then there's the limo on Mulholland Drive,
Mhm.
and how then Betty as Diane, is that her name?
Yeah, yeah. As
Yeah,
Diane Selwyn is the second identity for Naomi Watts.
right. So then she's in the limo on Mulholland Drive. The limo
Mhm.
still stops,
Right.
but
And
she gets out and sees her ex-girlfriend, and it's unclear, like, how
it's
many,
like
like, when she
somehow.
sees her, is it visions? Because there's earliers where she sees her ex-girlfriend and it's a vision, and it's
Mhm.
very clear that it's a vision. And then there's times later where, like,
Well,
she's
right.
there, but it's not clear. Is she seeing her for real? Like,
So
yeah.
because that sequence proceeds directly into like the Hollywood party, right?
Yep.
Where she is now, it seems like what it feels like in the moment is the sort of dream transition where two places that really don't have any connection to each other nonetheless transition in a way that sort of feels like it makes sense at the time. But so, like, what happens in that moment is that she's forced to get out of the car in much the same way that we saw Rita being forced to get out of the car earlier, except that when she does, her girlfriend just kind of weirdly walks out of the trees right there and says, "It's a shortcut, come this way." And then all of a sudden they're just at this fancy Hollywood like mansion that seems
Well,
unlikely that it was actually right there.
but I think they're also at the house where the director went
Yes,
and,
yes.
yes, and saw his
Well,
his
because that's the
girlfriend. Yeah.
director. The director, so Diane Selwyn's girlfriend Camilla, who is now
Who
played
is
by Rita's actress, right?
who's
Is
also Rita. Yeah.
is now has left Diane and has started dating the director, played by Justin Theroux. And that's part of the whole thing of like why she's jealous and angry and wants to hire the hitman. Yeah, and so but it all transitions in a way that like it seems incredibly unlikely that that house you can get to by just walking right into the brush on the side of the road up on Mulholland there. Like, I mean, I guess there are houses up in the hills there, but it doesn't seem like there's even a driveway or anything.
Right. And to your point, it's not meant
They feel
to
out in the middle of
be.
nowhere until before
Yeah.
that. Yeah. Um, and then of course on top of all of this, there's all of these different sequences that like barely connect at all. Like there's the scene with the two guys at the Winkies before even any of the other scenes there, where the one guy's talking about, um, I have invited you here, and I'm revealing now in an embarrassed state that it's because I had a dream about the two of us being here, and I'm trying to recreate it specifically because I hope that it won't go the way it did in my dream because I'm terrified about that dream. and then it proceeds to, as far as we can tell, play out exactly like the dream, and it seems as though that guy might have a heart attack. And then that whole scene, even though it sort of takes place in a location that we see later in other scenes, those two guys don't ever show up again. The
One of them,
person, the person, the scary person shows up again.
yeah, and one of the guys does show up before the scary person, but he doesn't do anything. He's there when she looks out the window of the Winkies when she's there
Oh,
later talking
okay.
to
Oh,
him.
right. Yeah, yeah.
He he's
Yeah.
just there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
Right.
it's like, but there's no reason that he's there. There's
Yeah,
no
it's almost like just a reminder of like, oh yeah, this
right,
is that spot.
right.
But
They're taking it back to the monster or whatever
mm-hmm.
that guy, the weird kind of a bum. Like I don't know that.
Yeah,
And by
it's
the way, that
obviously.
initial scene is terrifying.
Oh yeah, very scary. You could you could lift that whole sequence out and just have it be like a microfilm standalone on its own. You know, like, and it functions that way kind of in the movie because it really doesn't even connect to anything. And like on that same basis, we've got the cops who are investigating the accident scene, where Rita's car accident. Robert Forster's one of them, and we have a very sort of standard police procedural sort of scene with them, and then they just never show up again because that's not actually what the movie's doing.
Right.
But it's again, it's that sort of thing where like you kind of expect that scene to happen, but it doesn't really matter because what you're really just doing is you're just sort of taking all of the pieces of normal Hollywood storytelling with this sort of theme and you're just kind of moving them around in unexpected ways.
Yeah. And to that end, I think I don't know the exact timestamps, but let's just say for lack of a better term, it's maybe about an hour and 15 in to about an hour and 45 in. That
Okay.
half hour when it's like them trying to solve the mystery,
Mm-hmm.
like yeah, I mean he delivers that better than most noir mysteries. Like they're the way that again you have to put yourself in the time frame where they go to the payphone to call the cops and
Mm-hmm.
she remembers certain pieces and they're looking up people in the phone book and then they're going and they meet the neighbor and then
Mm-hmm.
they're sneaking into the apartment to
Yeah.
find the body. Like that whole thing like is in as a standalone like mystery,
Mm-hmm.
like it's really good.
Well,
Yeah.
right, like the tension of the scene where they have, first of all, they went to the apartment that supposedly Diane Selwyn's, and it's borne out by the little address labels. But then the person who answers says, "No, I'm not Diane Selwyn. I traded apartments with her. She's actually over there now." With no explanation for why that would happen. Oh, also she's been out of town for a few days. But then there's also some tension introduced with like, "I'll go over there with you." But then she's called away by a phone call. But then they go over, there's no answer, and they decide they're going to break in. And now there's tension of like, well, if this other lady is going to come over, is she going to see them breaking in? And the whole bit where Naomi Watts climbs in through the window, but then when she comes to open the front door for Rita, she's got her hand over her nose and got a dismayed expression, and we just know it's because she smells the dead body. Like it's there's no dialogue necessary to tell us that. We can see it just from that, her body language there, that she's like, oh no, I'm smelling a terrible smell, and it's hard to imagine that's anything but what it turns out to be, which is a dead body. But even that gets introduced like they have kind of run into a dead end in their investigation until they're eating at that same Winky's restaurant, and the waitress's name is Diane on her little name tag. And all of a sudden, Rita just says, "Oh, Diane, I feel like I remember that name, Diane Selwyn." And then that gives them their new lead. And it's, again, that's a very dreamlike sort of thing. To just, and it's funny too, because that same waitress later, her name tag says Betty in a later scene.
Yes.
So like all of this is very we you only briefly touched on the whole director's storyline, but like honestly some of my favorite scenes are in that whole plot line. Especially he gets more of the weird, like the really weird surreal ones, I think, through a bunch of the movie. And I think everyone else's scenes are more straightforward until they start getting weird towards the end. But like he's the one that like the bizarreness of this scene where he's been called by his manager to meet with these people that everyone seems scared of, who are telling him basically you are already recasting your lead actress, has to be this has to be this girl, this is the girl. And there's this weird stuff about like the one guy, it's like um, uh, the guy who set up the meeting is like, I did a lot of research. I know you didn't like the espresso last time, but I think you'll like this one. And before even trying it, the guy makes the waiter bring him a napkin. And then he does this thing where he like takes a tiny sip of it and then just literally like, bleh.
Yeah.
It's like not even like a discreet like spitting it gently into the napkin, but just like bleh, like he's a 3-year old who has just tasted something he didn't like.
Yeah.
And then everybody is suddenly terrified, and he like stands up like this meeting's over, and it's just this. And the other guy's like, "But no, they told me it's one of the best espressos in the world." And then, like that scene, like the tension is incredible and yet nonsensical, right? Like it just feels like, who are these people?
Yeah.
Dan Hedaya is, of course, one of these two scary guys in that scene, um, and, and that all leads, of course, to you mentioned that the director goes home because his movie has been shut down, only to discover because he goes home unexpectedly that his wife is cheating on him with the pool guy. And again, kind of like we were saying with that first Betty scene, it's like even the director is reacting in like I can't quite believe that this cliche is actually happening to me.
Yes.
And his response is to go grab her jewelry box and then
Pour
pour
paint
paint
on
in
it.
it. Which I don't know, as a sort of childish expression of anger, is actually a pretty good, that's a mean thing to do to someone. Which I'm
Yeah.
not saying she didn't deserve it in the moment. I'm just saying that like that would actually be a huge pain if you had a lot of fancy jewelry and it got paint poured on it. Like just imagine how much it would cost to clean all that up.
I guess that is actually so there are some more black comedy scenes in this
Mm,
than I remember now because that's one
yeah,
because again the pool guy is like essentially this like Joe Dirt character, right?
yeah.
With like the sideburns and the mullet,
Mm-hmm.
and but he's so determined that like the director still needs to be polite to his wife no matter what she's done,
Well,
right?
like so it's funny because like initially when the director grabs her jewelry box and walks away, the wife is like hurriedly getting dressed and she's already cursing him out like this is all your fault, you made this happen. And he's still laying in bed, this pool guy just going, come on now, he's probably upset.
Probably a
And
little upset.
I'm the one
Yeah.
that's being reasonable about this.
He's
And
the most reasonable in the whole
yeah,
scene.
except that
It's
of course,
hilarious.
then when when she starts beating up the director because he was pouring paint in her jewelry box, and he's trying to get her off of him, and so it's getting a little aggressive there. Then the pool guy, of course, comes in and hit the director in the nose, and so he is now he is thrown out of his own house with pink paint smeared all over his all black clothes, having to get into his very expensive car and drive away. And then of course he discovers that all of his credit cards and bank information has been shut off. They have found him at this seedy little dive hotel in LA, where just an interesting little connection there. He obviously knows the manager there from something unclear. But then that manager turns out to be one of the guys at that strange nightclub thing later. So we can imagine it's like, oh, okay, well, he knows it because it's performance arts related in some way. But anyway, like, but then he has to go meet with the cowboy,
Yes.
you know, and the
Which
cow,
it's such a great
yeah,
scene too. Like when
mm-hmm,
because he's making these he leads into it making all these smart ass references to his secretary or whatever,
mm-hmm,
and about, oh, am I gonna have to meet him at the ranch, whatever. And she's like, well, it is a corral
yeah,
at the top, and like, and then he goes up there and it's dark, and then the light flickers on, and the
mm-hmm.
cowboy steps out, and the cowboy is also being very reasonable, like
Well,
even though he's got a weird request for him.
he also looks like he has stepped right out of a 1950s Western movie.
Yeah, he doesn't look like a regular
He's
cowboy. Yeah,
not got a
he's like,
speck of dirt on him.
yeah,
But yeah, what he does is he comes out and just says, I'm going to speak very calmly to you, and I'm going to tell you right now that I think a man's attitude determines in large part how his life is going to go. Now, do you agree with me? And again, and he like forces him to say like, no, don't just say what you think I want to hear. I want you to really think about it. And if you really think that that's true, then you must not care about the good life because the things that you're doing are going to prevent you from having that.
yeah, basically his attitude.
Yeah, and
And he
so
says at one point, he's like, I think you were being too much of a smartass to actually think about the
mhm,
answer, whatever. It's like,
yeah.
do you enjoy that being a smartass? Like, he's just like calling him on his
Yeah, yeah.
attitude. Yeah.
And so eventually, and so he leaves him with the very ominous, it's like he says, okay, what you're going to do is tomorrow you're going to go back to work and you're going to audition lots of girls, but when this one comes in, you're going to say this is the girl, and if you've done good, you'll see me one more time. You'll see me two more times if you've done bad.
Right. Which
And
there's no payoff to that, right? Like he just sort of
well,
says it.
we do see him. We see him two more times, right? Because there's one time at the auditions where he kind of just walks by in the background,
That's right. I forgot.
right?
That's the other time. Yeah.
Right, and then of course later with when he wakes up, um, he wakes up Diane, right?
He wakes up Diane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we see him two more times. So does that mean we've done bad? But yes, it's just such a bizarre character. In some ways, I wonder if what year was The Big Lebowski? Big Lebowski was probably before this, right?
It had to have been.
1998, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say it made me think of the dude suddenly meeting Sam Elliott at the bowling alley
Hmm.
with that character just being like, why is there this cowboy-ass cowboy here? Why is he here? Not only that, but he's also like the narrator of the film in the framing device. So it's like,
Yes.
so it made me think of that. But yeah, so like there's so much going on in this movie that doesn't but it doesn't feel chaotic in a messy way. It all feels calculated and deliberate and with a flow that makes emotional sense if not logical sense.
Yeah, and I think that's also part of what makes this movie so difficult, right?
Yeah.
Is that it feels like it all makes sense, even though it doesn't. And so
Yeah. It
when you
everything makes sense in the moment. It just doesn't connect logically to the other stuff.
right, and I think that's one of the when people criticize it, I think that's what they're feeling is like, I feel like I should understand it, but I don't, so there must be something wrong,
Mhm.
right? And it's like, no, you're not actually supposed to understand it, right? Like
Mhm.
that's not how it's built,
Yeah.
you know.
So one more thing that I want to kind of touch on again here because I'm gonna call back to it when we talk about the other movie is that so much of what works and is interesting about this movie is not merely what we're literally seeing on screen, but the nuances of how it's being shown to us. And what I mean by that is things that I can't imagine how you would communicate in the screenplay. Because the screenplay would just have what looks like a very straightforward, cliched even, conversation. But on screen, the way the lines are delivered, the intensity of it, the time, the way the camera is looking at the characters, the timing, all of that stuff conveys this entirely separate layer of intensity and weirdness and suspense beyond the literal details of what is happening in the scene. You know what I mean? It's just like you could have a character who's just like, everything that leads up to the first sex scene, for example, right? Like that whole conversation where she's wearing the wig. Rita is wearing the blonde wig, and they're having this discussion of, well, you don't have to sleep on the couch. You can come in here and just, but every line kind of just has all of this extra space around it, and the delivery is all in the eyes and the pauses, in the way that everyone's talking, that it just gives a different feeling than some other director would probably get to just looking at the lines in the script. Does that make any sense?
Yes, and I think that's kind of what I was tapping into when I was talking about like how this movie doesn't work without Naomi Watts's performance, right?
Mm,
Like it's because hers is the most divergent,
yeah.
right?
Well,
And
yeah,
kind of
I think Laura Herring is also great, but you're right that her performance isn't kind of as flashy as Naomi Watts, because Naomi Watts kind of does more. But for
right.
the stuff that Laura Herring does, I think she's also great. I didn't mean to
Yeah.
cut you off. I just
No,
realized we
but
hadn't even talked about the nightclub performance. There's so much in this movie.
oh yeah. I'll have to go grab I can
Silencio.
yeah. I just I cut myself shaving the other
Oh,
day and I just kind of
uh
bumped
oh.
the scalp. So I just gotta grab something real
Okay.
quick.
Well, I'll
Yeah.
briefly just there's a scene where it's in fact after this sequence that we were just talking about, after this first sex sequence, where Rita wakes up in the middle of the night. It's 2 a.m. and she is apparently dreamed of this nightclub called Silencio, and demands that the two of them go and see this performance, which is just, it almost could be like that early restaurant sequence where it could be its own little standalone thing that almost doesn't even have to connect to anything else, right? It could just be its own sort of weird little performance, but it's just really hypnotic and captivating in a way that's hard to describe. Like, you just imagine reading the script and trying to figure out, like, how would you communicate this energy in the script? I feel like it would be very difficult. But the basic trick of this performance is the idea, they come out and they say it right up front that, like, we're hearing music, but he's saying this is not, there is no band, there is no orchestra, what you're hearing is a recording. But then repeatedly over the next few minutes during this performance, we keep seeing things that seem to be really happening, only for it to be revealed as, mimed to a recording. There's this woman comes out and sings a song in Spanish, and it is this, it's this very moving performance. But then, kind of midway through the song, the singer seems to faint, and yet the song keeps going
It's a recording.
because it's a recording, and yet you keep sort of forgetting that each time. Anyway, so like we could go on and on, I think, because there's just so much in this movie. But I was really pleased to rewatch it, and I expected, based on what people have, the way people talk about this movie, I fully expected that was going to be the case, in the sense that, like, I knew that, thinking back, the way I felt about this movie originally, I knew that I had grown since then and had come to appreciate many things that it's doing more, even without having to rewatch it. But actually rewatching it was a pleasure, so I'm glad we did it.
Yeah, I agree. I'm glad we did too. And that's the reason I chose it is that it was, again, it's something that you just kind of need a reason
Mm-hmm.
to commit to this.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm glad we did.
Mm-hmm.
So
All right, so let's go ahead and move on to Beau Travail, which is directed by Claire Denis, who oddly is a director that I feel like I know her as a director far more than any of her actual movies. So the sorry, I'm getting a text message. So she is the direct. Her first movie was Chocolat, which did get some attention, and I have seen that one. But I have basically not seen any of her other movies, and yet I sort of feel like I'm aware of her as a director, despite having not really seen most of her movies. Part of that, of course, is that she makes movies primarily in French language, so uh, you don't I don't necessarily see a lot of those. But so did you have any awareness of her as a director before we decided to watch this one?
I didn't. I mean, I've heard of Chocolat, but I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't seen it and didn't connect it to this movie. So this was
Mm-hmm.
kind of a new entry for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I didn't know anything about this movie going in. I thought, and only when we got to the end, which we'll come back to, did I realize that I had watched the ending in isolation previously and forgotten, because specifically what had happened was someone said, "Oh my gosh, Beau Travail has the most amazing ending of all time," and I'm like, "Huh, okay." And so I looked up just the ending and I watched just that ending sequence and said, "Okay, I mean, maybe it makes more sense in context." And didn't know anything else about the movie. And so and then I had entirely forgotten until it came up again when it happened watching through the movie. And I was like, "Oh, right, I did see, I did see this part." But so but yeah, I imagine you didn't know anything about this movie either going in, or did you look anything up about it before putting it on?
I just a brief that it's sort of loosely based on the Herman Melville
Yeah.
novella Billy Budd,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which I did read in college and wrote an essay on. So I was kind of familiar with like what happened in that.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, I didn't read any more. So
Yeah. So I did a little bit of research on this after watching it, and so I'll talk a little bit more about that part of it too. But just for anyone who is unfamiliar, it's pretty light on plot, which is not a criticism, but just the basic story of it is we begin with uh, Adjutant Chief Galou. Uh, is basically like he's sort of the sergeant of a deployment of the French Foreign Legion in the country of Djibouti, which is in like northeast Africa. It's like just across from Yemen. And and it's basically this crew of something like 15 soldiers or something like that, where it's the soldiers and then their sergeant, which is this guy, and then his commanding officer, who's also kind of stationed there. Um, and it is pretty clear from early on that they really don't have anything to do except to be ready for some undefinable possible need that might occur at some point. But it makes it basically, they feel like their job is to be soldiers, and that's it. They don't really do anything except maintain their readiness as soldiers. But we begin with voiceover narration from this from Galoo, where he is talking about that he thought of himself as the perfect legionnaire, but that maybe he made a mistake, and then the rest of it is kind of it is him telling the story in some respects, and that story basically amounts to um, he it really likes his commanding officer. He likes being the perfect legionnaire, but then one day they get some new transfers, and one of them is this guy, Gilles Santon, or something like. I'm doing my best with the French names there, but for reasons that are perhaps unclear even to Galoo, he just doesn't like this guy on sight. He's suspicious of him. Just hates him with an animosity that is not driven by any sort of a logical or rational basis. And he kind of makes it his he kind of becomes obsessed with this kid, eventually engineers a situation where he will be left to die in the desert. He contrives a situation that inspires Senton to hit him. Like, he's basically mistreating another soldier in a way that seems calculated to make Senton resist him. And then as punishment, he drives him out into the desert and says, okay, you have to walk back, but he has also sabotaged his compass. Eventually, through a series of coincidences, we know that Santan actually does survive but doesn't return, but separately, his compass is recovered, discovered by the other soldiers when they're going to a market, and they can see that it has been tampered with. And from there, they all put it together that it must have been Galoo that did it, and so as a result, he's going to be discharged from the French Foreign Legion for apparently orchestrating the murder of this soldier, even though we know he didn't actually die, but it's not the point. And so the end of the movie is him kind of despairing of this turn his life has taken, and going back to France. And we see him preparing to presumably kill himself. But then the actual ending is sort of a dreamlike dance sequence with this character. But so, like, that's the plot. But the reason that I was specifically talking earlier with Mulholland Drive about the idea of the difference between just the plot and the way the plot is depicted makes all the difference with this movie. So you're
Yeah.
nodding. Do you want to jump in?
No, I agree with you. I think this movie, it's told, like, the plot is very straightforward. Again,
Mm-hmm.
it's based on a novella, right? Like a very short story by
Mm-hmm.
Herman Melville that I'm not even positive he ever completed.
I'm pretty sure, like, that one was unpublished upon his death, but when they went through his papers, they published it
Right.
posthumously.
But either way, it's a short story, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you just described everything that literally happens, right?
Well,
And
sort of. It's a little different in Billy Budd. I can talk more about that because I researched it, but yeah.
either way,
The
yes,
setup is very similar.
setup is very
Um,
similar. Yeah,
yeah.
it's
There's
a
a new
very
sailor on a ship. The master at arms is irrationally obsessed with him, tries to destroy him. But in Billy Budd, what happens is when the young handsome soldier Billy Budd does hit him, it actually kills the master at arms dead just with the one blow. And it seems like it's literal, like the captain upon seeing it is literally just like it's like an angel made that happen, because it just seems so like unbelievable that that punch would have killed him. It seems like it must have been divine in some way. And yet, in Billy Budd, the problem that the captain then has is the law says that if a subordinate sailor hits an officer, and especially now that the officer is dead, even though I frankly can't blame him for doing it, I have to hang him now. Except that I guess there's more complicated stuff to it. There's more to it than that too. But just like so the plot is a little different, but obviously the idea of this sergeant type kind of being obsessed with this young and handsome soldier and hating him for that obsession is certainly the common parallel here. Also, just as far as a Billy Budd connection, Billy Budd was made into an opera,
Opera. Yeah, and
and a
they
lot of that opera is the soundtrack of this movie.
yes, I did know that.
I hadn't known that until I looked it up, but I thought that was interesting. But there is a whole subtextual layer to this that we really haven't touched on at all yet, which is to say that it's without it ever being explicit, it does seem perhaps the most likely explanation for Galup's obsession is that he is
Sure.
attracted to this young soldier, but cannot allow himself to. He cannot allow himself to accept those feelings, much less act on them, which almost certainly would be not not considered okay in the French Foreign Legion at that time.
Yes.
But throughout, so much of the movie, separate from the plot, is really just watching these soldiers work or train. There's long sequences that is just them running obstacle courses or building a road or whatever. And what's interesting in those scenes, first of all, they're beautiful. I mean, this movie's beautiful visually.
Yeah, the cinematography, the choreography, for lack of a better word, of
Yeah.
like the training sequences
Mm-hmm.
is incredible. Yeah.
Right. But one of the things that is hard to miss while you watch all of those sequences is, it is sometimes what is called in cinema the male gaze, right? It is, these are fit, athletic young men working their bodies hard and being shown to us in ways that highlight how beautiful they are. And I mean, I think that like that is part of, I think, this whole kind of subtext, right? Like the little bits of pieces that we get where it's more like, even where it's hinted at, we talk about when Galou is talking about his commanding officer that he really likes, Forestier, um, mentions there was this rumor that dogged him, but and then moves on without ever really getting into it. But we can imagine what it might have been, especially because, in addition to Galou, sort of like he has this whole really interesting dynamic with the other soldiers, even separate from Santan, where he is obsessed with like he's the best one, right? Like, and he's been there long enough. He's older, so he almost kind of has to be like the leader, like the sergeant, right? It just wouldn't make any sense for him not to be. But he is also as fit or more than all of those younger guys. And that's made very clear. But we also see that he's got a real attitude about it, right?
Hmm.
Like it is the idea of I wouldn't ask my men to do anything that I wouldn't do myself, but then turned like two notches darker.
Yeah. Like, and even in subtle ways, like there's the push-up scene
Mm-hmm.
where he's commanding them to do push-ups and he gets down and starts doing them with him. But when he goes up, he always does
He like pops
an
up like,
explosive push-up.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And he's making sure they understand like that without subtly, right? Like he's
Hmm.
not.
Yeah, because it's the neat nuance to it is that you could imagine him justifying this to himself or to any of them of saying, I'm working you very hard and I know it's hard, but I am willing to work just as hard. And so you should respect what I'm asking you to do because it's not like I'm some do nothing that's making you work hard while I do nothing. I'm right there with you doing it, working just as hard. And there's probably some element of truth to that. But they're also just really, we can see in his body language and we can see in the repeated pattern of this that there's also an element of, I'm the best and I'm not going to let any of you beat me.
Yep.
One of the first things that he observes about Santan when he's like telling us about this new guy that he just something wrong with that guy. One of the first thing he says about him is when they all went out for a night on the town,
He
he
walks in the
walks in
front.
front.
Yeah.
And it could be a trivial detail, but it is the detail he chooses to highlight for us. He's kind of he's a natural leader in a way. He's got a charisma to him, this kid. And we could imagine a reading where, as a closeted gay man, Galoo is sort of picking up on some of those vibes from Santan. But it could also just be he's got essentially a crush that he doesn't know how to process, right? It doesn't matter whether Santan is also gay or not, right? It's more just a matter of he's seeing something in him that he can't allow him to self to express and makes him feel vulnerable. And so he hates Santan for making him feel that way.
Yep.
And then what seems to actually be kind of the turning point is he observes a moment where his commanding officer is basically a little extra nice to Santan in a conversation where we learn Santan is in he's on like night patrol, and the commanding officer has come out. Forestier and is basically just asking him like, where are your parents from, that sort of thing. Turns out he was a foundling left in a stairwell, and Forestier says, well, you were a good find, which is, again, it could be sort of just a very banal thing to say, but again, as depicted on screen, it feels more weighty than that, right?
Yep.
It's not just a thing to say. It's I think you're a good find, that sort of thing. And it just feels like it's loaded in that way. But Galoo sort of happens to overhear that happening. And that's when he seems to kind of turn he becomes active rather than passive in his obsession.
Right. Yeah. He's not just frustrated writing his journal. He's
Mm-hmm.
actually making plans to how he's going to undermine,
Right. Yeah.
hurt him. Yeah.
Yeah. And so ultimately what happens is, because Santan had let his patrol, like the other guy that was supposed to be on patrol with him, let him go, like sneak off duty so that he could go to he's a Muslim and he was going to like a nearby religious observance. But technically he was supposed to be on duty. But as a result, Galoo decides to punish that soldier so severely, basically makes him start draws a square in the center of the courtyard and just says start digging, and basically just says I'll tell you when to stop, and is leaving him there until he's like several feet down, his hands are bloody, like he's about to collapse. And again, because he knows that they're friends, we can tell this is not about this other soldier.
Right.
This is about, I know this will make Santan mad.
He's going to leave him there until Santan tries to help him,
Yeah,
and then he can punish Santan for helping him when he wasn't supposed to.
right. And then Santan, unfortunately for him, plays right into his hands when he tries to offer his friend water. Galoo knocks it away, and Santan is so frustrated and angry at that moment at this cruelty that he punches Galoo, and of course can't do that. Not allowed in the French Foreign Legion. You cannot strike a superior officer. It's a thing apparently. And but this is, of course, we know, like we hear in the voiceover narration that although like the specific details weren't all kind of concretely worked out, this was all a plot because
Yeah.
the punishment for the hit was to drive him out into the desert and make him walk back, but he had already tampered with the compass. So it was all planned. So in a sense, even though it turns out Senton was ultimately rescued by some people who found him on the salt flats, he certainly would have died. And so it's very much premeditated attempted murder on Galoo's part here, right? And then ultimately it's discovered that he, we touched on the details of that earlier. Forestier, when he talks to him, it's an interesting scene. I think there's not a whole lot to it, but at the same time that Forestier is basically saying, you can't do that and then stay. That can't happen. You have to go back. But you can see a sadness in him. Like we've had the sense throughout the movie that Forestier, although he never said anything, he was maybe more in tune with all of this happening than he had let on. And so what he is seeing here now is a sadness of like, maybe he's wondering if he could have done something sooner that maybe would have stopped this. Is there something he could have said? And yet we also get the feeling that maybe part of the reason he didn't is because how could he explain how he knew without kind of feeding that dogged rumor sort of thing, right? Like, I can understand what you were feeling, but the feeling is something that you cannot possibly admit is true and is something that you feel so in knots about that you were going to murder someone for it. And also, I know what you're feeling because I feel it too, and but I can't say that either. That's a mess, right? But so in any event, Galoo is sent back to France, and we see him, aimless for a little bit. He talks about in his like diary entry, he says, he's unfit for civilian life. Well, actually, what he says is unfit for life, unfit for civilian life. And we see him preparing, presumably to kill himself. And like the last shot we see of him in that sequence is he makes his like little hotel bed in the military style, with the like clean corners and all of that. Then he lies down on it. He's not wearing a shirt. He's got a gun. And we see, like, the way he's laying, we see his pulse beating in a vein on his arm. And we're also looking at the tattoo on his chest, which apparently in French says, serve the good cause, then die. Is what the tattoo said. And so again, the implication is that he is about to commit suicide. But then we cut to a nightclub. And this is a nightclub that we had seen before. It's the one in Djibouti. But it's empty now, except for just him, dressed in civilian clothes. And he proceeds to do a pretty incredible dance. That, I'm reminded of Billy Elliot in the sense of someone who has felt unable to express themselves trying to do so through dance. And this guy, as we had established all the way through, this guy's in incredible shape. Like,
Yep.
he's like, and so he is very athletic, and he is a good dancer, and the dance is just expressing all of these different kinds of emotions, and it's simultaneously sad and angry, and also we can kind of imagine that, like, if only he had been somewhere where he could have been more open about himself, maybe all of this tragedy would have been averted. And we can we can imagine in moments of that dance another world where that could have been what happened instead of what did. But then, it's like parts of the dance, it seems like he is definitely imagining another person there that he's dancing with, right? But yeah, so I don't know
Yep.
what I mean. So what was your take on the ending when it happened?
I mean, my take was that he did kill himself, and
Mm-hmm.
that freed him.
Yeah.
Like, as sad as that is to say, like,
Right.
he was freed in death
Mm-hmm.
in a way that he wasn't in life.
Yeah.
And that's what the dance sequence is that was what.
Mm-hmm. He was finally free of all of like the rules and systems that, to some extent, society, but also his own personal
Correct.
hang-ups had imposed on him.
Yeah, he was, all of those things were just released, and
Mm-hmm.
this was, he was going back to that place in Djibouti where, because he talks about that a number of times in the
Mm-hmm.
film, about like, I wasn't present enough, like
Mm-hmm.
I didn't notice the mountains and the people
Mm-hmm.
and the rivers and the oceans. They're all just things in my memory,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like going back to a place that he was happy but constrained,
Yeah, because we
and
had
that's,
we
yeah.
had seen some that nightclub in some sequences before, like when the soldiers would eventually occasionally go into town. What was interesting is like there's a couple of shots of him dancing with the woman in on the crowded dance floor. Like the movie opens actually with a scene of women dancing at that club.
Yep.
Um, but in any case, we had seen some of that. But mostly, when everyone's going into town, we see the other soldiers together, and we see him obviously drunk following them at a distance. Right? Like there's that one sequence where we see the other soldiers. They're walking down the street with the cars coming up behind them, and the one car has the commanding officer in it, and he's talking with the cab driver, but then they stop because Galoo is like staggering down the street, coming from the other direction, like about to fall over on his feet.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think, well, so like, what did you think about this movie? I really liked it, but at the same time, as we kind of said at the beginning, it's a challenging movie. Um, it's interesting, but
Yeah, I mean, you in sort of your freeform discussion of the entire movie that you went through, you did touch on everything. I mean, it's the movie is so beautiful because of the subtext, right?
mm-hmm,
Like, like you talked about Mulholland Drive. If you just took the screenplay and read it, it's one thing. But when you see it on screen,
mm-hmm,
it's a different thing, because every scene, it's not just the words that people are saying to each other,
mm-hmm,
right? Like, it's all of the emotion that is kind of below the surface.
mm-hmm,
And then it's weaved together with this really beautiful like cinematography.
mm-hmm,
It's paced out with like the, exercises of the soldier exercises,
mm-hmm.
which, yes, again, I think part of that is to like put some sort of the shirtless male form into it, but some of it is also just really very well
Yeah,
choreographed, right?
yeah,
Like, it just
100%. Yeah.
it's it's taking a lot of, there's a lot of things from, like samurai Asian stuff, like, like some of their, they do like more Tai Chi style things,
Mm-hmm,
like it's it's and it kind of gives it a weird pacing that
mm-hmm.
just makes you pay attention.
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah.
anyway, I was just gonna say, it was more. interesting of a movie to watch than any of the actual dialogue or plot points would lead you to believe, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Because, like, that's what I was just going to kind of chime in on there is that, we kind of mentioned that big parts of the movie's runtime is just watching the soldiers do stuff, right? And I think that it would be easy, I think, to hear that without watching the movie and think that sounds like it would be boring or repetitive, but it's really not. When you're watching it, like, you don't wish you were watching something else. It's compelling.
Yeah.
Especially like lots of the little exercises they do. Like there's a bit where they're just, it's, like they seem to be just doing some kind of a Tai Chi sort of thing, but they're just all in the sun and it's just the way the camera is moving around them. It's just beautiful. And there's a bit where they're like just doing stretches on the ground in sync, but it's like ballet. There's a bit where, uh, what they're doing is apparently something that the actual French Foreign Legion kind of really does almost as a way to cool down from some of their more dangerous training exercises. But it's the thing where, like, all the guys are sort of paired off, their shirts are off, and then they go in and it's like going in for a hug, but like aggressively, like smashing into each other and then pushing off. And then boom, pushing off. But like to the point where they're really like colliding
Yeah.
in an aggressive way, but it's an embrace and then pushing off. And it's like, we were just talking about the subtext, right? But it's also at the same time you can imagine that being something that would you could imagine that being a real like a bonding moment for a crew, doing something like that. They're training hard and then it's just like, they're it's there's a physicality to all of that stuff that is really interesting and depicted in a compelling way. Yeah. So, yeah, I was really very pleased with both of these movies. Although, like, I don't know that I would put on my personal list necessarily these at 7 and 8 of all time. But that's not necessarily what the list is for. Just just like when we talked about Jean Dielman, it's like, is it the best movie of all time? It's a little bit strange to say that when so much of what it's doing is commentary or reaction on what other movies do, right? So, but but it's all interesting for discussion, and I really liked both movies.
Yes. I enjoyed watching both of these.
Yeah. All right, cool. With that, do we want to talk about our theme for the next time? You had suggested a good one. I'm on board. Let's tell
Yeah.
us
I
about it.
mean, it's summertime, so let's get away from the heavy movies. Let's go
Mm-hmm.
to some, you know, action adventure. And the new season of Jack Ryan on Amazon Prime just came out, so it
Mm-hmm.
made me think. So obviously, the streaming services help out with this, but they have put the old Tom Clancy movies are all available now, and I thought those would be some fun ones.
Sure.
I had originally thought to try to pick some, you know, key ones, but you took it on the impression that we're going to watch all of them.
Well, I
There
don't
are
know.
actually aren't that there
Well,
aren't that many of them though.
I
So
I am
yeah,
not opposed necessarily to the idea of watching all of them. What would it? How many are we talking about? Is it 4 or 5?
I think so. If it's purely Jack Ryan, it's Hunt for Red October, Clear and Present Danger, Patriot Games, Some of All Fears. I
Okay.
think so there's four. But if we're going to do those, I would like to watch the new reboot, which isn't Jack Ryan per
Mm-hmm.
se, but it's meant to be the new Jack Ryan outside of the Jack Ryan universe, which is Without
Okay.
Remorse.
All right. Okay. So Hunt for Red October, um, Clear and Present Danger, Patriot Games, Some of All Fears, and then what the new one is,
Without Remorse.
Without Remorse. Okay. All right. So what I had
All are
said,
fun.
yeah,
Yeah.
what I had said in our discussion, which holds true. Part of the reason I was naming those others was not necessarily that I was suggesting we do all of them. I'm not opposed. Was more just like me trying to even remember what they are, because I remember Hunt for Red October pretty well, and I'm pretty sure I have seen the others, but could not tell you a single plot detail about any of them. So it's and it's not like a dig on them so much as it's just like I don't remember them well enough to pick among them. Um, but I'm excited and interested to rewatch. Have you read much Tom Clancy?
I have read The Sum of All Fears, which it was going to be a tough movie no matter what. And I think and we'll get into this, but it was when they changed over from Harrison Ford to Ben Affleck,
Mm-hmm.
and they thought they were going to reboot with him. It's not Ben Affleck's fault. Like it's a tough novel to
Hmm.
translate into a movie. I mean, all of his stuff is. And then I read one that could never be made into a movie. Um, it's about World War III. I can't remember what the title of it is.
Hmm.
But anyway, I read two of them and I was like, eh, they are good because they tell a great story.
Hmm.
But one of his like kind of nuances is that he's very like loves to dive into the details of stuff.
So the reason I asked was because the one of his books that I tried to read was Red Storm Rising.
That's the one about World War III. That's the one I
Oh,
read.
okay. Well, so
Yep.
what I was going to say about that in my attempt to read it previously is that it opens up with a banger of an action sequence. Great stuff. And then it starts talking about Russian history. And 40 pages later, it's still talking about Russian history, and there has been zero plot movement in that time. It
Yeah.
is just history. And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm going to read something else now, I think. And so I never went back to it. Which is
So
not to say, I mean,
yeah, I've finished Red Storm Rising and it's very good, but you have to bear through that
yeah.
beginning part.
I
And
get,
the
and
sum of
I
all
imagine that stuff does, at least to some extent, matter. And he's covering it not just because he's interested, but because some of it is relevant to what's going to happen.
it
Or is it?
is it is, but he leans way into that stuff,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that's why, well, again, we'll get into it, but I think that's why like Hunt for Red October is so good
Oh yeah. I
because
love
that
that one.
right, and that movie it took the two pieces of what he does well,
Mm-hmm.
which is a cool story about war games essentially, and his nuances about technology, and it just managed to like sync it together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the whole idea of this like secret sonar drive and all that stuff, like in the book, like I'm sure, like I haven't read that one, but of the other ones I've read, I mean, that's 100 pages just describing how the friggin' thing works, right? And it takes 5 minutes in the movie,
Yeah.
but they get the essence of it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what Some of All Fears is like super weird because it's hard. It's all about nuclear bombs, right? So the first 100 pages of the book are like how nuclear bombs work, and it's a lot to get through. You're just like, all
Mm-hmm.
right, like I get it. You're splitting atoms.
Yeah. Well,
Happens.
so I think
Anyway,
I know how, even though I don't remember them, I remember broadly speaking thinking, oh yeah, I like those when you mentioned Tom Clancy movies. So I am on board. We're gonna watch the 5 Jack Ryan movies, including Without Remorse, even if I guess technically that one doesn't have Jack Ryan as a character.
it doesn't, but what
It's
it's meant to be is to take the concept of Tom Clancy movies and launch it into a new franchise. So
mhm.
I think it's worth it. I mean, it's again, if we're gonna watch 4 movies, might as well watch five,
Uh,
like because there's
well,
a through line to it.
and it'll be nice too that you have been watching the Jack Ryan show too, right?
Yes,
And I've heard good things, but I've also got a lot of TV to watch already, so
it's
have not
very
picked
good.
that one up.
Yep.
But so I guess we will leave it there, and so We'll be back to talk Tom Clancy movies, and in the meantime, everybody, watch good movies.
Watch good movies.